Hey everybody, welcome back to our continuing coverage of Fort Fisher. This is our second video here at Fort Fisher near Wilmington, North Carolina. We're with Chris Fonville once again. And Chris, we talked about fortifications. We talked about the Wilmington setup. Check out that other video. You'll see the link. How do we get here in December of 1864 to the first battle of Fort Fisher?
It should have come a lot sooner, Chris. It should have come in 1862 or 1863. But remember, federal forces went after Charleston instead, left Wilmington alone. That worked to the benefit of the blockade runners and the Confederate supply chain. Fort Fisher came about as a result of politics as much as anything. The war was going badly in Virginia for the Union in 1864 as Lee and Grant are engaged in a battle of stalemate, with Grant launching massive frontal assaults, unable to break through, trying flanking movements against Lee's strongly entrenched army without success. And then Gideon Welles goes to the White House and implores President Lincoln to support an attack on Wilmington. By then, Mobile Bay has been sealed by Admiral Farragut, his flotilla of gunboats. And Lincoln, who has been largely indifferent to coastal operations, more interested in strategic interior cities like Richmond and Vicksburg and Atlanta and Chattanooga and so forth, now sees an advantage if Wilmington can be closed to the blockade running trade fairly quickly. His political campaign is not going well. In fact, in July, he predicts that he would not be returned to the White House unless the war turns in favor for the Union. So a quick victory at Wilmington might convince a war-weary northern populace to support Lincoln's efforts to end the war on the battlefield and not at the peace table as the Democrats wanted to do, to negotiate a peaceful settlement. So Lincoln gave Welles the green light to plan an attack on Wilmington, but deferred final approval of it to U.S. Grant. Grant was indifferent to an attack on Wilmington, believing that he needed more troops in southeastern Virginia to go after Lee, rather than detach an expeditionary force of upwards to 10,000 troops to attack Wilmington 240 miles to the south. On the other hand, he understood Lincoln's political dilemma and knew that if Lincoln lost the re-election campaign, then Grant's own job was in jeopardy. So he agreed to support the troops or the attack when the time was right, and did not give up the troops until after the election was over. And that came about as a result of the fall of Atlanta in early September and General Phil Sheridan's scorched earth campaign in the Shenandoah Valley in September and October. And so Lincoln is back in office. Grant, however, still needs to give up troops for an expeditionary force, and that comes about in December of 1864.
Yeah, it's amazing. You brought up a few things there, but I just want to mention we do have two different navies in the war. They're the same United States Navy, but we have what's called a brown water Navy and a blue water Navy. And we're actually seeing a combination here around Wilmington, because we have the Atlantic behind Chris, and behind Gary we have Cape Fear, the Cape Fear River. So you can use these two different types of vessels to try to assault Fort Fisher or the other fortifications around here. But check out our Navy videos that we do have over at our YouTube channel that cover Civil War navies, and check out our visit to the CSS Noose, which is not too far from here. We were just over there the other day. So Chris, now it seems like we're gonna put together a star team to come here to Wilmington and take out Fort Fisher. So we're gonna go for Godfrey Weitzel, and we're gonna go get David Dixon Porter. Is that how this all plays out?
Yeah, Gideon Welles initially wanted to give command of the Naval Task Force to capture Fort Fisher to David Farragut, who had captured New Orleans in '62, had closed Mobile Bay in August of '64. But Farragut, totally exhausted by campaigning in the Gulf, declined. Instead, the command went to David Dixon Porter, who was Farragut's foster brother. And Porter was very controversial, as you know. He had commanded the Brown Water Navy and the Mississippi Squadron, but was narcissistic, conceited, egotistical, difficult, but tough as hide leather too. He was the guy you wanted by your side in a barroom brawl. So if anyone was capable of capturing Fort Fisher from the Navy side, it was David Dixon Porter. The Navy would lead the attack. Porter would take command of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, headquartered in Hampton Roads, Virginia, in October of 1864, and assemble the largest fleet of the war, 150 vessels, from which he would select 64 ships to attack Fort Fisher, including 4 monitors and the new Ironsides, the most powerful ship in the United States Navy, and 5 steam frigates. So this was the largest fleet for an attack on a seacoast fortification during the war. And Grant handpicked General Godfrey Weitzel, the old engineer from the Army of the James, to be his commander of the expeditionary force. But the headquarters was commanded by Major General Benjamin Butler, who had been at least partly responsible for the capture of New Orleans in '62, but he and David Porter had butted heads there. So Butler intercepted all the memos from Grant to Weitzel. Weitzel later claimed he never knew that he'd been appointed commander of the expeditionary force, and in fact, Butler finagled his way into going along on the attack by coming up with a novel idea of packing a ship with hundreds of pounds of gunpowder and exploding it off Fort Fisher, with the idea that it would create tornado force winds that would simply blow down the sand walls, and his army could then march in and mop up, capturing the survivors, and the fort would fall fairly easily. So Butler takes over command. The problem with that is that, as Butler later wrote in his memoir, David Porter hated me like the devil hates holy water. So here you got the 2 major service branch commanders who were supposed to work in harmony, cooperation, to attack and capture the Confederacy's largest, strongest seacoast fortification, guarding the Confederacy's principal seaport and most important city, and they hate each other. Dislike is too kind of term. They hated each other. So it does not bode well for the success of the mission at Christmas 1864, which is when the attack came about.
You know, the fire ship, which is an ancient type of warfare idea, he's going to take it to a whole new level.
Yeah.
It's obviously not going to work because we're standing up on top of all these impressive fortifications, are we not?
Yeah, and critics called it Butler's folly, Butler's toy. It did not work when they detonated it early Christmas Eve morning, 1864. And then Porter would unleash the largest naval bombardment of the Civil War for 2 days. And Butler, when he came down from Beaufort, he put ashore only 1/3 of the expeditionary force of 6,500 men. Again, he was angry that Porter had detonated his pet powder project without him being on the scene. He was not in a mood to cooperate with Porter, so he only put ashore a small portion of the expeditionary force. And then they advanced southward from their landing point and saw that despite the intensity of the bombardment, the fort was still in very good shape. All of the artillery along the land front that guarded the ground across which the army would have to attack, it was all in place. And so this was going to be a murderous scene, Godfrey Weitzel thought, like the 54th Massachusetts attack at Battery Wagner in Charleston in 1863. So they aborted the mission. So there really wasn't much ground fighting in the first attack on Fort Fisher. It was principally a naval bombardment, but again, the largest of the Civil War when all was said and done. By the way, I got to tell one great story though. The fleet was trying to establish its effective range of fire on the fort that, remember, from offshore looked like a bunch of haycocks, just low profile fort. What they could see, however, were the Confederate flags flying above the fort. So they concentrated on the Confederate flags, and Colonel William Lamb, the commander of the fort, figured out pretty early what they were doing. So he took all the Confederate flags and moved them to the far west end of the fort where we are now in an effort to get the fleet to fire in the direction of the new placement of flags. And that's exactly what happened. Lamb later wrote in his post-war memoir that at least 1/3 of the 20,261 shot and shell thrown at his fort on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day 1864 went over the fort and into the marsh and Cape Fear River to the west. It was the biggest waste of gunpowder in the annals of warfare, he wrote. However, at one point, he wanted a flag flown on the far south end of the sea face. There was a 43-foot high conical battery known as the Mound Battery because of its shape. And Lamb sent word down there, I want a flag flown over the top of that battery so that the Union fleet can still see that we're here and fighting. And Captain Daniel Munn, the commander of the battery, looked for a volunteer to shinny up the flagpole because it was not attached with halyards. And he turned to one soldier, a guy named Noah Bennett, and he said, Private Bennett, climb that flagpole and attach the flag. Bennett weighed in at about 200 pounds and couldn't make the climb. So a volunteer, Christopher Kit Bland of the 36th North Carolina, stepped up and said, I'll do it. So with the flag in his mouth or cradling under his arm, he climbed the flagpole to attach it to the top of the mast. And the Union gunners on board those ships offshore saw what he was doing and directed their fire on him. And so, totally oblivious to the exploding shells around him, he attached the flag, came back down, only to look up and see that the flag had been knocked away by an exploding shell. So he reclimbed the flagpole, reattached the flag, under heavy fire from the Union warships offshore, to the cheers and adulation of his comrades and to Union sailors and Marines on board those ships who said, now there's a man's man, and they cheered him for his bravery and courage.
That's a pretty great story. So we're standing at Fort Fisher. So we have to fast forward to January of 1865. Okay. So we have a battle, the second battle of Fort Fisher, and this fort, as you said, is kind of like a 7 from the
bird's eye view.
Bird's eye view. So what's going to happen next? We're going to have a Union force landing here on the beaches. This will be made up of United States colored troops heading to the north. We'll have soldiers and sailors and Marines here. Well, a lot of times you don't hear about Marines. So the Marines will come in with the sailors. We'll have a force there. We'll have another landing force of infantry, and we'll have that flotilla back out here. How does this second battle shape up and end up for the Confederates?
Okay, the first battle ended up being a Confederate victory. General Lee was so determined to keep Wilmington in Confederate hands that he dispatched a division commanded by Major General Robert F. Hope, more than 6,400 troops to make sure that Wilmington remained in Confederate hands. But they kind of straggled in right at the end and shortly after the first Battle of Fort Fisher. The Federals have aborted the mission. They have now returned northward. Lamb and Whiting, who has come to Fort Fisher as a volunteer combatant and advisor, are absolutely certain that the Federals will return for a second attack sooner than later. But General Braxton Bragg, who has been sent to Wilmington to take over command from Whiting, much to the chagrin of Whiting and Lamb's troops, and the Virginia media, who, by the way, said Braxton Bragg has been ordered to Wilmington, goodbye Wilmington. Braxton Bragg was known as not a fighting general. People did not have faith in his leadership capabilities except for Jefferson Davis. So Bragg has more than 6,400 troops at his disposal to reinforce Fort Fisher, but instead takes them Wilmington for a grand review on January the 12th, the very night or the very day that the Federals returned for a second attack on Fort Fisher, this time not just to close the harbor to blockade running, but to capture Wilmington in support of General Sherman's Carolinas campaign. So this time there's a greatly increased expeditionary force of about 10,000 men that will include 2 brigades of United States colored troops, as well as General Alfred H. Terry, who has taken over command from General Butler, who has been fired and sent home to his factory girls in Lowell, Massachusetts. He will take over as commander of the expeditionary force, his first important assignment, independent assignment. So he has a Delbert Ames's division from the first attack, 2 brigades of United States colored troops, Terry's own personal brigade, so there are about 9,600 forces. But during the second attack, which would be the second largest naval bombardment in the Civil War, and this is the largest combined Union operation of the Civil War, Admiral Porter will send ashore a volunteer force of 2,261 sailors and Marines to assist the attack on the fort by the United States Army. So the Army is going to attack on the west end of the land face where we are now, while the sailors and Marines will attack along the beach and hit the northeast bastion. And the time is set for the late afternoon of January 15th, 1865.
And so we have, basically a two-pronged attack that's supposed to come in here
Yes.
and then have the naval support fire. How does this play out? I mean, the Confederates in here, how many Confederates are we talking? We have about 10,000 or so Union soldiers coming towards them. How many Confederates do we have in here, and how does this play out?
Okay, well, the U.S. colored troops established a line of defenses halfway between here and Sugarloaf, where we'll go later this afternoon, to protect the rear of Delbert Ames's division, which will make the attack. About 3,200 white troops that will attack the fort. But inside the fort, at any given time, there are only about 2,000 troops. Probably 500 by the time of the attack had been wounded or killed. And these are, keep in mind, Chris, these are artillery, right? They're not trained in infantry tactics. But now they have to come out from underneath their bomb-proofs and fight. And fight they did. Union soldiers later said that the Confederate defenders fought like tigers, and this was close quarters fighting. The attack began about 3:30 on the afternoon of January 15th. The fleet of warships sounded their steam, blew their steam whistles. The Union division under Delbert Ames was in echelon, would attack the west end of the fort. 3 brigades. The first brigade, led by N. Martin Curtis, who, by the way, was 6'5", from the old 142nd New York. And when he went off to war in 1861, his family goodbye, they meant that literally. He was wounded several times during the war and almost killed here at Fort Fisher. So they led the attack. Confederates came out of their bomb proofs and then manned the gun chambers. The problem was that this time, rather than fire on the flags of the fort, Admiral Porter had instructed his gunboat commanders, tell your gunners to concentrate on destroying or dismantling all of the artillery along the land front that covers the ground across which the Army has to attack. And that's what they did. Only one Seacoast gun managed to survive that intense bombardment, so that when the Union Army attacked, they only had to contend with riflemen and light artillery. So it was a much easier proposition than it would have been even 24 hours earlier. And at the same time, sailors and Marines, volunteers from various warships in the fleet who didn't know each other. You might take 15 guys from the USS Gettysburg and 50 guys from the USS Colorado, send them all ashore, and they had to fight in concert with one another. So that was a little bit of a disheveled, discombobulated sort of effort. But they did distract the attention with a large number of Confederate forces, led by Whiting and Lamb personally, that mounted the parapets and shot down into the Union sailors and Marines as they attacked the fort, because they understood that if that part of the attack was successful, then the fort would be breached and its fall would be only a matter of time. Unfortunately, on the far west end, where the main Union Army attack was, there were only about 500 Confederate infantry. They were supposed to be supported by some reinforcement that Bragg finally sent into the fort. Johnston Haygood's brigades of South Carolinians, about 350, 375, but they didn't come out of the bomb-proof, so that when the Union Army attacked here, you've only got about 500 infantry or artillerists that are now fighting as infantry, but they're in the bottom of the bomb-proofs. Rather than get up on top or the parapet of the fort and fire down into the Union soldiers as they attack the fort, they're down in the bottom of the gun chamber. So there's a dead zone of about 75 to 100 yards where they can't see the Union soldiers. So the Union soldiers make their way to the fort, dangerous run toward the fort, but when they got there, they assembled at the bottom of the wall of the fort, and then like a big giant blue tidal wave, they just poured over the top of the ramparts, jumped down into the gun chambers where we are now, and fought hand to hand against the Confederates for possession of each one of these gun compartments. And there was a lot of fighting over here to the west at what's called the Bloody Gate, one of 2 entryways into the fort. But slowly but surely, they pushed their way eastward and then southward to capture the fort late on the night of January 15th, 1865. But this was some heavy, intense fighting, close quarters fighting, and even hand-to-hand fighting for a long time.
Thanks, Chris. And to wrap this up, there's 2 things we need to talk about very quickly. Number 1, the explosion of the powder magazine that took place shortly thereafter. And number 2, the preservation of the fort, because we're only standing in a very small portion of the fort, and it's impressive what we have here. But what happened to Fort Fisher in the years that followed the American Civil War?
Yeah, Fort Fisher was captured at 10 o'clock on the night of January 15th, 1865, but that was only the first step. Remember, capturing Fort Fisher was only the launching of an attack on Wilmington. So the harbor has now been closed to blockade running. General Braxton Bragg, encouraged by Richmond to counterattack and retake the fort, refuses to do that. He's got 6,400 troops at Sugarloaf, only 4.5 miles away, and he refuses to use them effectively to either reinforce Fort Fisher or to attack the rear of the attacking Union Army. And now, rather than counterattack and try to retake the fort, which is absolutely crucial to the Confederacy survival, he abandons the forts at the mouth of the river at Old Inlet, withdraws them to Fort Anderson, where we'll go later this afternoon, and at Sugarloaf to protect Wilmington. Well, what good was Wilmington as a blockade running seaport once the fortifications at the mouth of the river had been captured? Wilmington was of little worth. So the Federals now will begin their advance on Wilmington in February of 1865. The fort, unfortunately, only about 25% of the fort still remains. Erosion, wind, rain, storms got most of it. In fact, when Colonel William Lamb returned to Fort Fisher for the first time 10 years after the capture of the fort, he said that the waves of the ocean were already lapsing on his sea face batteries. And that erosion continued so that by the 1940s, much of the sea face is gone. There was an effort to preserve the remnants of the land face because all of the sea face is gone. There was an effort in the mid-1990s to protect the remnants of the land face by putting in riprap, big large boulders, and that effort has worked. So the once mighty stronghold suffered, a lot of erosion and destruction due to the elements, and not to a Union Army and Navy. But the portion that's left is impressive. The site of the heaviest ground fighting is still here. We're standing atop Shepherd's Battery, the far west end of the land face. So it is now a state historic site. There was an effort in the early 20th century to make it a national battlefield. They could not get the political support that they needed to make that happen. It became a state historic site in the mid-1950s. It is the most visited state historic site in North Carolina. In fact, more people come to Fort Fisher than all other state historic sites combined. Upwards to 1 million visitors come to Fort Fisher each year, and I hope that you will be one of them in 2020 or 2021. I hope you were one in 2020, but if not, I hope you are one in 2021.
Awesome. Well, we thank you, Chris. We're going to have more videos with Chris and Angie, who showed up on another video. So you have to go back and watch the first portion of this Fort Fisher video. And we have a lot of great things to bring you here from the Wilmington area. I'm Chris White with the American Battlefield Trust. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for supporting battlefield preservation. Head over to battlefields.org. Click that donate button, become a member today, and we hope to see you online and maybe on the battlefield as one of those millions of visitors. Millions, I'm doubling it, down here to Fort Fisher in 2019, 20, 21, 22. I'm up in Chris.